So I've seen Marvel. Growing up a '90s kid, watching, you know, uh, particularly being drawn to the art, right?
Yeah.
And for me, I followed Jim Lee and Alex Ross in particular. Some of the greatest
Yeah, Jim
artists
Lee's great.
that I've seen, and they've hopped over to DC as well. So it's not as though they're any stranger to comic books. But Marvel, in a sense, is like the great American myth, right?
Mm,
Just like Star Wars is for a lot of people, including myself. But you have your modern day Greek and Roman gods, right? You have your
right.
Zeuses, you have your Jupiters, Apollos, but you have them in the form of Captain America, right? The symbol of patriotism, the symbol of what America could be, should be, and always must be, even when America itself is not at that moment. And you see that connection with the readers and the writers in terms of how they're feeling about the times, right? Whether it's Captain America fighting the Nazis in the early 30s, 40s, to
Yeah.
him becoming nomad in protest to the government policy in Vietnam, and then you have U.S. Agent, which we now have in
Right.
some of the streaming channels. Um, so yeah, it's the great American myth again, but so well done in the comic book artistry that we know of today. Um, some of my favorites. I don't know if you have favorite
You
comics.
know, it's pretty fascinating you mentioned all this American myth because it
Yeah,
is kind of true. It's a very dark time, especially when you're coming out of the Depression
yeah,
and when you're
yeah.
going through what a lot of Americans were going through at this time of kind of hopelessness. There was famine. There was a lot of backwards policies of people not being able to get jobs, getting
Yeah,
decent
yeah.
pay.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have like these small little strips of comics from these small creators, small people. Most people don't really know, but it kind of goes through word of mouth,
Yeah.
comic issue to comic issue, people's enjoyment. There's just joy, there's escapism. I think they were pretty cheap back then too, so it was
Very.
easy to just grab it off the
Five
rack or
cents, ten
shelf.
cents.
Yeah,
Yeah,
anywhere you want.
it's
So
been in
the
that.
1930s of that era of the
Yeah,
Depression
yeah,
into the 1940s of the war,
yeah,
there was a desperate need to revitalize some kind of hope in some way, for especially for kids. So kids, young adults. So I would see that American myth of bringing back joy through these small comics, and even through adults. Adults knew about it. They got it for their kids also. It's pretty fascinating to see the evolution of that American myth as time goes on, and that it's actually kind of now globalized too.
yeah.
So whatever that fight
For
was
better or worse,
in
globalized.
America, yeah, better
Yeah.
for us. Whatever that fight was in America to revitalize some kind of hope and joy. I mean, you would see that also not just in comic books. You would see that in the movies. There would always be some hero fighting somewhere against the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
Captain America was
Mm-hmm.
that big influence. Superman was that big influence too. So
Yeah.
there was just that need. The American myth. That's a great term for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you also mentioned, and I love that you said this. Superman was one of Stan Lee's biggest draw when it
Hmm.
came to stories. He was one of his favorite heroes. So again, I always call Superman the kind of the granddaddy archetype of the comic book hero.
Oh yeah. First
Um,
action hero.
but kind of what you mentioned there too. There is a levity. There is a lightness of joy. There is comedy. There is action. There's adventure. All in these little scripts, right? All in these little packets for kids.
Hmm.
And when you think about it, part of the genius of that comic book, especially back in the day, was you're bringing joy to children who live and breathe joy, right?
Oh
They
yeah.
are
They should be at
they're
least.
unburdened
Yeah.
by the ailments of society. At least even at that time, children were working. They were going through all sorts of different conditions than we are today, thankfully. But they were the quickest to feel joy out of reading these kind of stories.
Hmm.
So when you look at the hardships that Stan Lee went through in terms of poverty, in terms of trying to get a comic book sold, getting the medium to take off the ground, and you can kind of look at the comic book industry. You can look at the what do they call it? Approved comics.
Yeah.
Because of course the government has to get involved in anything good. especially when it has to do
Well,
with
yeah,
like
because there was
propaganda.
also propaganda
But
campaigns.
so
Yeah.
you and then you of course you look at again Captain America and selling war bonds to support the troops. It's amazing. You mentioned adults. It's amazing how easily a message can spread, both of joy but also of fear, of action adventure but also darkness
Mm,
in this medium of the comic book.
yeah.
But speaking to Marvel, um, for myself at least, growing up in the '90s, again looking at Jim Lee's art, particularly for the X-Men. I don't know if you ever saw those encyclopedias that Barnes and Nobles and other bookstores would
I
sell,
did. I have
like
seen some of
from
those.
A to Z,
I
every
haven't seen them
single
in a
X-Men
while.
comic book. Um, but looking at that art and looking at the detail that goes into each character profile,
Hmm.
their hardships. You look at Magneto, who, you know, whether it's the X-Men animated series or the comic books, he must always suffer some catastrophic hardship
Yeah.
to harden him as a child, grow up into the man that creates the Brotherhood of Mutants, and eventually becomes the very thing that he fought to destroy. And then as you kind of grow older and you follow Magneto's character, you see him become the hero he was always meant to be,
Yeah.
and kind of take that dual partnership role with Xavier. I'm kind of talking in circles, but
No, I get
it's
what you're saying.
the point I'm trying to make is within comic books exists again the hero's journey.
Hmm.
That is the piece that, at least for comic books, makes it much easier to latch on to kids and teach them morality,
Yeah.
teach them ethics, teach them right from wrong.
Hmm.
But it
The old
doesn't.
fables.
But the writing back then, particularly in the '90s, and even when you look at Black Panther being one of the first
Hmm.
Black American, oh not Black American, Black superheroes,
Hmm.
which was unheard of. And the referencing of the Black Panther Party, um, them taking that on as
Yes.
well, and holding pride to it, which one should.
Hmm.
Um, but you see that lessons of morality, ethics, courage, compassion, um, to avenge one's loved ones.
Right.
Um, you can reach a broad audience without destroying your product, right? You're holding true to the story, and your ultimately your product is the sensibility of
Right.
oneself,
It's
right?
interesting you mention all this too because yeah, there is a balance that has
Yeah.
to happen in between these comic strips, and sometimes you see it in like shows like Scrubs,
Mm-hmm.
where there's lots of jokes and it's a lot of humor, it's really funny.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to, as a writer, be very skillful in how you transition into the sad moments where you
Yep.
start getting your audience
Yep.
into tearjerker moments, or where you realize, oh wow, they're actually mentioning something here. There's a purpose of why they're mentioning it. Getting to the serious part, getting the emotion they want out of the audience, and then bringing them back to the levity of
Right.
all of it,
Right.
and
Right.
realize that's
Don't keep
why I
them in the
came
dark.
here. Don't keep them in the
Yeah.
dark. Bring
Yeah.
back the levity side of it. So you mentioned the X-Men. You mentioned Magneto.
Yeah.
Magneto is an example of this. Again, back to the 1940s, we're going into the war. Magneto is a result of the Holocaust. He's a result of something very serious and very dark in history, in a huge part of European history, of American history too, because of the war. And they're
Immigrant
able
story.
to show this in his origin story. They're able to show this in X-Men, but also show the levity of the teamwork between the X-Men people. The levity even with Magneto's side of the team too, with people like Toad and Sabretooth,
Yeah.
and like the jokes
Yeah.
they share with each other where they dig at each other. So there is still some levity and heart in all these characters. When they need to get to the serious moments, when they need to show and demonstrate, hey, this is the dark area, we need to get there. This is what we really need to tell you. Okay, now you understand it. Let's bring it back to the fun. Let's bring it back to levity. There's lots of influences here. You mentioned Black Panther. Yes, 1960s. I mean, X-Men was released, I think, a month after. I might be wrong about this, but the assassination of Malcolm X.
Yes.
So there
Um,
is also an
yeah.
influence there between the Black Panther Party, between people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and the differences between peace and vengeance.
Right.
How do you fight people through peace? How do you fight people through just pure vengeance?
Right.
And then how does those two groups mash together? Um, And that's a serious topic. That's a very serious topic. How do you bring that serious topic back to levity? And I think there is some skillful work done in stuff like Marvel, in Magneto, in Professor X, and the morality lessons he provides, not just to his X-Men, but even to his old friend Magneto.
Yeah.
That actually reflects also on how Martin Luther King reflected on Malcolm X. So there is parallels here, that I think Marvel is an expert at doing it. It depends on the writer. It
Yeah.
depends on who does it. But there, at the end of the day, people come to these comics because they want the levity, they want the joy, they want to be reminded of some things, they want to get the morality out of it, but a sensibility of morality, real understanding of reality, how people act, how people react, and then what's the movement forward. And that's a skillful writing decision by some of these writers. So, I mean, it stands the time. That's why we're still talking about it 100 years, well, 80 years later, and 60 years later with X-Men.